I regret to tell you that Dr. Tony Press has COVID. And he hasn't reacted for that because I can see him right here. Dr. Tony Press has been instrumental in drawing our program together. He is the adjunct professor at the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies and the chair of the Tasmanian government's Antarctic Gateway Advisory Committee. He was formerly the CEO of the Antarctic Climate and Ecosystems Cooperative Research Centre and head of the Australian Antarctic Division. And due to the unexpected absence of our first speaker at the beginning of this week, he agreed to give the first presentation on Australia's Antarctic interests by Zoom. So I hope you will bear with us and that the technology will behave itself. I now introduce our replacement chair, who so kindly stepped in, Dr. Andrew Jackson, who learnt of his role on Sunday. Dr. Jackson is also the ex-head of policy at the Australian Antarctic Division and has written extensively on Antarctica. He works at the Institute of Marine and Antarctic Studies. Would you please welcome Dr. Jackson?
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody for the warm welcome. I've got big shoes to fill, trying to stand in for Tony Press, who I can see. He's shaking his head, but Tony is very well known in the Antarctic community in Tasmania, across Australia, and in fact across the world because of his involvement in various Antarctic forums. So we won't waste much time on the introductions. You've got the program in front of you. There's a full program. I'm going to try and keep it to time, and I've got the little Antarctic Treaty System bell, which I'll ring if necessary to call attention to get us back onto the schedule, but I'm sure we'll go well. So I'm going to start by welcoming Adjunct Professor Tony Press to give us his presentation on Australia's Antarctic interests. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Andrew. Hopefully the technology will work. Okay, so we'll give a traverse through Australia's Antarctic interests and our activities in the Southern Ocean in order to set the framework for a logical and open discussion about security to our south. I will leave time for questions at the end of this. So I expect that there might be a few things come up that require clarification. I'm quite happy to go back through my presentation and clarify anything that people wish to have clarified. Australia's a very large country, actually, if we think of it as more than just the continent itself. Our responsibilities, our jurisdiction go from below Africa and Madagascar up to the tropics and then east to New Zealand. We have the third largest maritime jurisdiction in the world, without counting the Antarctic. And if we look at the continental shelf, we have if not the largest, one of the largest extended continental shelves in the world. Australia's Antarctic interests have been shaped for over 100 years by our historical Antarctic exploration, particularly the efforts of Douglas Mawson and others, by the discoveries that they made, and by the science that's been conducted in Antarctica since that time. And I make a point about the science because when we come into discussion about the Antarctic Treaty itself, this continuous thread of exploration, discovery, management, and science is what holds our sovereignty to Antarctica. We have the Australian Antarctic Territory, which is around about 42% of Antarctica, or if you want to think of it, it's around about the size of Australia without Queensland. It's a large part of the Antarctic continent. And our sovereign claim is valid. There's no doubt about the validity of the sovereign claim to Antarctica. And then there is the post-war period and the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty, of which Australia was an original negotiator and an original signatory to the Antarctic Treaty. And I'll go there in a minute. So here we have our historical connection, our sovereign connection, and our role in the international negotiation of one of the world's most important international treaties. This map, produced by the Australian government, by the Australian Survey Office in 1939, is the first comprehensive map of Antarctica. It was created and published not only to show the Australian Antarctic Territory, but also to show in detail our knowledge of Antarctica at that time. You can see there, it has the Australian Antarctic Territory here and here. It has the French Antarctic Territory, Terre Adélie, there. It has the New Zealand Antarctic Territory, the Ross Dependency, and it has the United Kingdom's Antarctic claim. It does not have, for instance, does not show, for instance, the claims of Chile, Argentina, and Norway. By the time the 1940s arrived, there were 7 claims to Antarctica. There's the New Zealand Ross Dependency, there's the Australian Antarctic Territory, Terre Adélie, Dronning Maudland for Norway. And I should point out that Norway's claim was in fact urged by Great Britain in order to forestall any German claim to Antarctic territory in that region. And then here we have the 3 overlapping claims of Chile, Argentina, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So that was the situation in the immediate post-war period. Australia's Antarctic claim was transferred to Australia in 1933, arising principally from the efforts of Douglas Mawson. And in 1936, Australia proclaimed the Australian Antarctic Territory. We were expected and keen to do more work and exploration in Antarctica, but the war broke out. In the post-war period, there were two sets of related concerns about Antarctica. The first was concern over the status of Antarctic claims, particularly the overlapping claims in the peninsula area of Argentina, Chile, and the United Kingdom, but also the status of Australia and other claims. The United States of America and the Soviet Union had been active in the Antarctic in the immediate post-war period, and there arose great tensions of Cold War conflict and the potential for that Cold War tension to result in the militarization of Antarctica. And I think Jeff McGee later on in the day will address some of those issues, but it is the background to the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty itself. Operation High Jump, for instance, conducted by the United States, was a huge operation where there was exploration around the coast of Antarctica and the use of over 3,000 personnel. It was organized through the US military and was a very active program in mapping Antarctica with one eye, it must be said. In the early papers, the United States were very clear that one of the things they were doing was laying the groundwork for a claim to some or maybe even all of Antarctica. So it's in this context that the Antarctic Treaty was negotiated. The stimulus for the negotiation of the Antarctic Treaty came out of the International Geophysical Year from 1957 to 1958, in which there were scientific expeditions to the North Pole and the South Pole, or to the Northern Arctic and to the Antarctic, in order to look at the physical, biological, and other aspects of the environment and space around Antarctica. It was an international collaboration of many countries in the Arctic, and in the Antarctic, it was a collaboration of 12 countries. Those 12 countries were invited to Washington to discuss this problem of Antarctica, the problem of how do we resolve the issues of territoriality, how do we resolve the potential for Antarctica to become a place of conflict. Those 12 countries are there: Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Soviet Union, as it was then, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States. You can see there that 7 of those countries were claimant states. The United States and the Soviet Union both asserted the right to claim any or all of Antarctica. They were the countries that came in and negotiated what is a remarkable international treaty. Given the problems of territoriality, and the problems of, or the tensions of the Cold War. So the Antarctic Treaty is a quite a small treaty, extremely brief, but expansive in what it covers. Its first article says the area should be used for peaceful purposes. Second article, freedom of scientific investigation. The fourth article, which is incredibly important for the claimants, for Australia in particular, essentially sets aside arguments over sovereignty. And I'll make that quite clear. It sets aside arguments over sovereignty. The Antarctic Treaty does not set aside sovereignty in Antarctica. What it does is to say that everyone's position will be held as it was when the treaty was negotiated. So there's nothing in the treaty that diminishes Australia's sovereign claim to Antarctica. And then quite remarkably, the Antarctic Treaty provided a disarmament clause so that Antarctica can't be used for military purposes. It can't be used to test weapons, and it can't be used for testing nuclear weapons and dumping nuclear materials. And in order to ensure that parties were compliant with these provisions, the Antarctic Treaty allows for open inspection of any facility in Antarctica by any Antarctic Treaty party. In the Cold War period, that's quite a remarkable set of provisions. So Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. There shall be freedom of scientific investigation and cooperation towards that end. The treaty prohibits measures of a military nature, including military bases, military manoeuvres, and weapons testing. It does not preclude the use of personnel for support of Antarctic activities. It does not prohibit the use of military facilities or military equipment, as long as that military equipment is being used for peaceful purposes and in the pursuit of science. And this was further reinforced in 1990 by the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty, which designated Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And I must reinforce that these sentiments and these provisions of the Antarctic Treaty and its associated instruments have been reaffirmed many times over the years, and including quite recently by all Antarctic Treaty parties. I'll spend a little bit of time here looking at the modern Antarctic program. This is the Noina, the most advanced scientific icebreaker in the world, a remarkable piece of equipment, a beautiful embellishment to the port of Hobart when it's back in town, and a magnificent platform for both science and some of the science that can be done on this vessel is absolutely remarkable. Even though it's only been going through sea trials over the last season, its contribution to Antarctic knowledge is already significant. And it's a wonderful vessel for logistics and resupply, and will reshape and mold the future of Antarctic science and Australia's ability and capacity to collaborate with other countries in Antarctica. The modern Antarctic program, we have 3 continental stations. Mawson, the oldest continental station in Antarctica, established in 1954. Davis and Casey, as well as a number of other field facilities, and of course our historical connections to where Mawson first went to Antarctica. The Wilkins Aerodrome, which services Australia's A319 aircraft and the military C-17s in resupply and support. We have intracontinental air capability, which at this stage we hire in to support our program. But with the addition of Noyina, there'll be additional capacity to use heavy lift, long range helicopters from Noyina, and they will also contribute significantly to our intracontinental air capability. The Antarctic Division, through recent government decisions and support, have built a deep sea field traverse capability, rebuilt from the ones we used to have in the 80s and early 90s, into the ability now to go deep into the field in Antarctica and do incredibly important science there. Part of which is this pursuit for a 1,000,000-year-old ice core, in fact, an ice core that may indeed be much older than 1,000,000 years. And not only is this a very, very important piece of scientific endeavour, it will also contribute significantly to the global understanding of climate change and the future projections of climate change by looking back into the past to a period in which the climate of the planet was very different from what it is now. And Australia has invested quite significantly in marine science capabilities and, as I mentioned there before, our contribution of Antarctica to our understanding of climate science. Now, all of that seems very stable and peaceful and productive, and it is. There's no denying that. But in recent years, there's been an increase in concern about security issues in Antarctica, about militarization of Antarctica, and about the intent of certain Antarctic players, including, I must say, accusations against Australia. This photograph was published on the ABC around a story about China trying to claim a section of Antarctica surrounding Dome A or Kunlun Station, which is inland from Australia's Davis Station. And it was an article that promoted very high tensions arising in Antarctica. The interesting thing is the footprints that are shown there are the footprints of people that went to retrieve an Australian mobile astronomical laboratory that was situated by the Chinese with Australian cooperation at the Kunlun station. But nonetheless, this discussion about militarization, about arising tensions is real. And part of this seminar today is to look at those statements, those considerations, and unpack what they really mean and how the future of the Antarctic Treaty System might pan out. So, if tensions do arise in Antarctica or are arising in Antarctica, what is it that Australia is most concerned about? Where do we position ourselves in that discussion? And how do we protect those things that are vitally important to us as a nation? Not so long ago, the Australian government published openly its national Antarctic interests. These historically, and when I was director of the Antarctic Division, were quite well buried in cabinet documents and not freely available out in the public domain. Those Antarctic interests are to maintain Antarctica's freedom from strategic and/or political confrontation, to preserve our sovereignty over the Australian Antarctic Territory, including our sovereign rights over adjacent offshore domains, to support a strong and effective Antarctic treaty system, to conduct world-class scientific research, to protect the Antarctic environment, to be informed about and be able to influence developments in a region geographically proximate to Australia, and to foster economic opportunities as long as they don't impinge on the ban on mining and oil drilling in Antarctica. If you look at the first three, freedom from strategic and political confrontation, preservation of sovereignty, and supporting a strong and effective Antarctic treaty system. Those three strategic interests, those three national interests of Australia are interwoven. The Antarctic Treaty and the fully functional ability of the Antarctic Treaty system to operate is a key part of preserving our sovereignty over Antarctica. If the treaty were to fall apart at some time in the future, if that were to happen, then our ability to defend our sovereign interests in Antarctica would change remarkably. Part of maintaining that strong and effective Antarctic treaty system, of course, is keeping a very keen eye on the strategic and policy, the strategic and political conflicts that may arise in the Antarctic treaty system. So what are the likely touch points that might cause an erosion of the stability, or are causing erosion of the stability of the Antarctic Treaty System? Is it going to be about territory? I don't think so, at least not in the short term. Is it going to be about living resources? By that I mean fish, and principally fish, but krill in Antarctica. Well, yes, I think that's where issues are emerging and have emerged, and may impact relations in the future. Will it be about minerals? I doubt it in the short term, for many reasons. Some of those are technological, some of those are political. But at the end of the day, trying to overturn the ban on mining in Antarctica will be very difficult. Is it going to be about military use? Well, that's something that we'll talk about today. Will it be about water? Will it be about tourism? Or will something else happen, like external tensions? But we would be in Antarctica anyway, even if we didn't have the Australian Antarctic Territory, I think, because Antarctica is so important for us. For instance, Antarctica drives weather systems, which some of you have lived through for the last 10 days or so, that have a profound impact on the Australian climate, and also show us that the historical climate of Australia can be found inside the ice cores in Antarctica. We also know that Antarctica has the best precise historical record of climate, and proves that carbon dioxide and temperature are very, very, very tightly related. We also know that Antarctica is going to be incredibly important to us in the future for sea level rise. I'll close off now by saying Antarctica is important to us. It's proximal, it's peaceful, it's safe. We have historical and economic connections that are important for Australia. Antarctica is important for science that will give us information about our future. Australia has a legitimate claim to the Australian Antarctic Territory, and that claim has not been diminished. We have strong historical ties, we're an original signatory, we're an important player, and we have our own defined Australian Antarctic interests. So today, what does the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia mean? How do we deal with the rise of India and China and other nations? Who are our allies? What are the alliances we have politically in Antarctica? What do we do if the treaty fails? I mean, my view is that we should do everything possible to ensure the treaty doesn't fail, because the future without the Southern Ocean being free from conflict, without Antarctica being free from conflict, is a very bleak future indeed. Who are our Antarctic allies, and how will they react if the treaty fails? And I'll leave it there.
So Tony, if you're well enough, you can stand by for some questions that might come from the audience. But first I'm going to introduce Dr. Joe Vince, who's going to be the responder for your presentation. So thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Tony, for a wonderful introduction to the session today. And what Tony talked about was highlighting the important historical presence that Australia has had in the Antarctic region. And politically, it is important to see that it was actually conflict and tensions and issues of security that started many of the issues and negotiations around the Antarctic Treaty. On the one hand, it may have been the conflict and security issues, but Tony also told us how it was an example of international cooperation that resulted in the Antarctic Treaty in the end. And the way that it has worked over so many years is still very important for our strategic position for Australia. The use of the military, while it is constrained, is still there and something that we cannot underestimate, particularly even in these peaceful times. The scientific investigation that occurs in Antarctica is also incredibly important. And this is something that we think about when we're looking at the Antarctic Treaty system, the balance between the science and also the peaceful approach to the Antarctic region to ensure that this science continues. Today, our program is continuing through the modern Antarctic program that Australia is involved in. However, as Tony alluded, there is that increase of concern in Antarctica, including the militarisation, and rising tensions are real. So the question that I believe that can arise from what Tony talked about, and something that we will probably discuss throughout the day, is can we maintain Antarctica's freedom from strategic and political confrontation? And my question for all of you is, do we have the capabilities to do this? Or is it the science political at all? And if we're not finding that our science by Australia in the Australian Antarctic region is not political, does it mean that other countries involved in the Antarctic region do have some political side to the science as well? And moving forward, there are a number of areas of vital importance, as Tony described, one of those being whether we'll have political tensions over living resources. I completely agree with that. I think that is something that we will need to keep an eye out, even though the krill fishery, which is one of the most abundant fisheries in the world, it raises questions about who is actually fishing for the krill and what their intentions are in the Southern Ocean. And these external geopolitical issues are something that we do need to keep an eye on, as Tony alluded with his questions at the end. I hope this helps with a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. So there's a healthy list of questions there. I'll open it up now for questions or comments from the floor. We have roving microphones, so just wait until they come to you. There's a question over there. Sure.
There are a number of nations involved in the Antarctic which are not signatories to the treaty. Would you care to expand upon the relationships, the communications, the attitudes of those nations to the treaty? Are they to be viewed as rogues or potential future members, or what?
Let me say that slide I put on earlier only showed the 12 original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. There are now many more signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. The countries that are involved in Antarctic activities, that is science in Antarctica or doing things like fishing in the waters around Antarctica, are either signatories to the Antarctic Treaty and or signatories to the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, so that there are now 29, I think, consultative parties to the Antarctic Treaty. That is 29 countries that have active Antarctic programs and are engaged actively in Antarctic activities, and therefore have the right to be engaged in making law about Antarctica. So some of those countries are going to be countries like Brazil, China, Peru, India, that countries that weren't original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty. Are they the countries that you were concerned about?
Yes, they were, but I wondered whether there were, sorry, start again. Yes, they were, but I wondered whether there were further countries again that were in neither of those two sets.
The answer to that is no, really. There are a couple of countries that have shown an interest in becoming Antarctic Treaty parties and have engaged with others in scientific activities in Antarctica. For instance, Malaysia, which is now a signatory to the Antarctic Treaty, but hasn't applied for consultative status yet. And there are some emerging countries such as Iran, for instance, Pakistan, that have in the past signaled that they may want to conduct Antarctic scientific activities. And then the last one, which I must point out, because it's directly relevant to the discussion today, is Canada, which applied for consultative party status at the recent Antarctic Treaty meeting, but in fact, because of objections from China, was not that application was not able to be dealt with at this meeting. Hopefully, it'll be dealt with at a future meeting.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name's Paul Irving. I'm from the RUSI National Board. The issue with the treaty, implicit in that is an understanding that the signatories to the treaty and the other countries that are wishing to participate abide by the rules of international law. What's the situation where one or more countries ignore the rules of international law and therefore basically make the treaty useless? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, well, as far as I can, that's a situation that we see at the moment with Russia illegally invading Ukraine. Complete abrogation of any responsibility under international law. That would put us in a very difficult, us Australia and like-mindeds in a very difficult situation if that happened. That a flagrant breach of the conditions of the Antarctic Treaty or its other instruments were to occur by a treaty party, or even, for instance, if it was to occur by another a non-party to the Antarctic Treaty. That's a situation that we haven't had to face, but it's a situation that occurs under international law, that potentially occurs under international law in any situation. Just on that point, we're also entering the age where some of these activities might actually be by non-state players. So what happens if a rather large corporation that's bigger than many, many states in the world decides it wants access to rare earths in Antarctica, in some of the uniced areas of Antarctica, and move in as a rogue corporation to do that? That's completely outside of the bounds of the treaty itself, and that would have to be dealt with not only by decisions of parties within the treaty, but by nation states taking direct action outside of the treaty against those corporations. Now, we'd also need to do that if a state's party to the treaty decided to do that themselves.
Tony, I'm interested as to the control and regulation of the living marine resources around the Antarctic. Are you able to elaborate?
Yes, Antarctic marine living resources are managed under the Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which is actually, its secretariat is headquartered in Hobart, in Macquarie Street. It is one of the most important marine management organisations in the world, and it has an exemplary record for managing the marine resources of Antarctica. It makes decisions every year about catch limits, about how much of this resource or that resource is able to be exploited, and has since 1982 managed to ensure that the marine ecosystem or ecosystems of Antarctica are preserved. It doesn't mean that it's not under pressure. There are Russia, for instance, has over the last couple of years blocked a number of measures which can only be seen to be acting in bad faith, using a spurious excuse of science, when in fact there's no science behind their reasoning, to ensure that certain measures couldn't be made. And we've seen this over the years with the proposals to build marine protected areas in Antarctica. So even though Kamala is probably one of the most successful marine management organisations in the world, and regional marine management agreements in the world, it doesn't mean that it is immune from political interference by bad players.